Good morning. My name is Leah Duzy. It's a pleasure to be able to present to you this morning. I wish that I was there in person, but life has a way of getting in the way of the best laid plans. So this is a good alternative. If you have questions, I do have colleagues in the room that can answer those, or they can be directed to me at my contact information, which will be on the last slide, or is either through ACS. So today I'm going to talk about developing practical, effective, and implementable mitigations in pesticide registration using a sequential and repeatable approach. Before I get into the presentation, I'd like to thank my co-authors, Annie Kruger, Andrew Clausen, and David Campana. They have been instrumental in moving this approach forward. We have been working on it, which I will cover in a little bit, for several years, and they have really gotten it to the point that it is, and we are very excited about where we are heading in the future. So without further ado, we'll move on into the presentation. So why is there a need for a sequential and repeatable approach? The intersection of ESA and FIFRA requires the creation of new tools and applications that pair ecological risk assessment and listed species information. There is a need for a high-level view of listed species, their status, their vulnerability to extinction, and their risk to pesticides to help work through national-level pesticide evaluations and consultation. These national pesticide consultations and the evaluations are evolving as EPA adapts and works through its approach and their work plan that they released in early 2022. These are evolving and changing, and we know that things are going to continue to do that in the coming years. To keep up with this changing landscape, we need a tool that's flexible and adaptable, compiling constantly updated species data to support the needs of all stakeholders involved in the pesticide registration and registration review, particularly pesticide registrants and EPA and Fish and Wildlife and National Marine Fishery or their services. Having this high-level view of listed species will not only support national pesticide consultations, but it can also help support systems-level approaches to species conservation. Since early 2022, there's been an increased focus on pesticide regulation in ESA with the release of EPA's work plan and the subsequent work plan update and the numerous other documents that have come out from EPA since the beginning of 2022. However, conversations around the process of sequencing species are not new within the registrant community. Initial conversations around species sequencing related to pesticide regulation started in 2018 as part of a collaborative project with CSI and Syngenta. Over the next 4 years, discussions were initiated with the services, both Fish and Wildlife and NOAA Fisheries, EPA, and USDA to discuss the process, including overall concept, data, and outcomes. This process has gone through numerous iterations due to evolving ESA policy from EPA and registration and consultation decisions from EPA and the services. The resulting sequencing process is flexible, adaptable, and responsive. We talk about AMPS, the avoidance minimization, and other measures for pesticides and species. It is a multifunctional tool to identify species for which reasonable and prudent mitigations may need to be explored at species, individual, and population levels. The process of sequencing risk and vulnerability can be used to inform suitable mitigation measures. We have a publication in preparation, and a web tool will be available this fall at the URL provided. The approach used in AMPS can be broken down into seven steps. So we're going to step through the sequencing process and we give a little overview of each of the steps. So step one is understanding the pesticide label. This is where we capture information from the label to accurately reflect the action, including how the active ingredient will be used and existing label language, minimizing potential offsite movement or exposure. Step two is to spatially represent the label use footprint. This is where we translate the labeled uses to existing spatial layers to represent use sites across agricultural and non-agricultural uses inside and outside the continental United States. So this is meant to capture all labeled uses. This is not just agricultural uses. Step three is intersecting the use footprint with species. This is the traditional overlap analysis. So step three would be overlaying the label footprint with species range and designated critical habitat spatial data from the services to calculate the % species area overlapping with a use site. Step 4 is interpreting the overlap. This is where we move into what we call level of effects and exposure. This is where we incorporate the ecological risk assessment to determine which species are at risk due to predicted direct toxicity effects or indirect effects to a species via direct toxicity to a species prey, pollination, dispersal, or habitat. In step 5, we incorporate the species risk modifiers. This is where we utilize refined information on species biology, the species attribute data to determine the risk of exposure to a species based on life history attributes, species vulnerability, and susceptibility to pesticides. In step 6, we sequence the species. Now, sequencing can kind of happen through all of these different steps, but step 6 is where we put it all together. We mathematically sequence a species based on the degree of overlap, ecotoxicity, vulnerability, and the addition of risk modifiers. And we'll really be going through specifically steps 5 and step 6 in just a little bit. And then step 7 is where we determine the degree of avoidance, minimization, or mitigation measures needed to resolve species risk based on the level of exceedance, application of risk modifiers, and labeled the protective measures that are already on the label. And these are the kind of the 7 steps. I will say that AMPS can both build the sequence and can unpack the sequence. So you can move through AMPS from both ways, from the beginning, step 1, or starting with step 7. And we are really going to start, in the remainder of this presentation, we're going to kind of work backwards using an example. AMPS has been designed to answer a variety of questions and provide support for discussions surrounding avoidance, minimization, and other measures. And we're going to kind of give an example and using one species because it's very easy to get lost in all of the data. We're going to use one species to walk through the process. So the scenario we chose to use for this example was a general insecticide. This is where there are direct effects to insects and indirect effects through diet of insects, obligo relationships, insect pollinated plants. We're going to be using use in orchard crops. So UDL 70, you can see in the map to the map on the screen that the majority of this use data layer is focused here in California. You've got a little bit of the footprint here in Washington and Oregon. There is some here in Georgia, Florida, throughout Texas, but really it's focused here on the West Coast. We also selected one species to follow through the process, and I'm not going to say that species yet. I'll get into that in a minute. So we're really starting at step 2. So we don't have a label because we're just using a general insecticide, but we are focusing on the orchard, so that is step 2, and then we're going to move through the process. Providing a little bit more information for the scenario overview, we move into step 4, which is the level of effects. And I know it feels like we've skipped step 3, but we will come back. So we move into the level of effects, and this is where we've seen the biggest change in AMPS from earlier versions, and where we've done a good bit of refinement into the approach and this step in particular. So in this case, in the graph to the right, you'll see a taxon specific RQ. We look at taxon specific RQ exceedances. You can see the taxon listed there. And then the level of effects, which is the RQ divided by the level of concern on the y-axis. So the green dots indicate a passing RQ, so no effect, so a passing risk quotient. The yellow dots indicate a slight exceedance of the level of concern, and the red dots indicate a significant exceedance of the LOC. You can see here we have one red dot for terrestrial inverts, which is what we laid out in the scenario in the previous slide. The gray bar here indicates a feasible window for minimization measures to resolve risk concerns. Risk concerns may be resolved at the taxon level instead of at the species level. And this is demonstrated. You'll see we have some yellow dots for freshwater aquatic inverts, a yellow dot for estuarine aquatic inverts, and then the other taxa have green dots. And so this is really kind of setting up that step 4 level of effects as we move into the remaining steps. So our next step is really to combine step 3 and step 4. So step 3 is the generation of overlap with species ranges with the use footprint. In this case, UDL 70 or orchards. With step 4, which is that level of effect where we're looking at the risk quotient and the level of concern. So at this point, we combine the effects with the overlap to give us the level of effects and exposure, and this is typically where EPA has stopped with some additional risk modifiers that they've been adding in recent biological evaluations. We do utilize at this step EPA's 5% overlap threshold. You'll notice here you have this gray horizontal box. This is species that are in this box would have overlap with use data layer 70 of less than 5%, and species in this box here on the vertical axis would have level of effects of 1 or below. That would be where risk exceedance equals the LOC. You'll notice that for species that are in either this gray rectangle here, the vertical gray rectangle, or the horizontal gray rectangle, would be of no concern or unlikely to be of concern as it relates to effects and exposure. They would be lower on the sequence. The species that we're going to use as our example species is the valley elderberry longhorn beetle. It is higher. Has a higher level of effects, and it has a kind of around 30%, 32% overlap with UDL 70. We will use this species as our example as we move through the remainder of this presentation. So just to give you a little bit of backgrounds about the valley elderberry longhorn beetle, it is a federally listed terrestrial invert that feeds and reproduces on elderberry plants in riparian areas along rivers in California. You can see a map there that is from one of the Fish and Wildlife documents that demonstrates where those extant populations are in California. There is designated critical habitat for this species, but it is completely encompassed inside the Fish and Wildlife designated range, which encompasses most of those rivered areas in California in the map to the right. They are present in mating and repairing habitat from March through early June, and peak populations are found from late April to mid-May. So there is a temporal component to this species. When you look at recent determinations by EPA, both in methanol and the proposed revision to the PID, as well as the draft BE for cyanotranilipole, and then the final BEs for sulfoxaflor, thiamethoxam, clothianidin, and imidacloprid, the valley elderberry longhorn beetle continues to come up as a likely to adversely affect and likely jeopardy species, and the AMP sequence reflects that for a general insecticide. In methanol, the valley elderberry longhorn beetle was a pilot species in which EPA developed a PULA to go along with that, and that is in that proposed interim decision. Through this presentation, we want to demonstrate why this species is at the top of the sequence and how AMPs can be utilized to inform these discussions. We're going to jump on to step 6. We're going to skip step 5 and we're going to come back. So we're going to jump straight to sequencing the species. The sequence extends greater than 12 orders of magnitude, so the log scale really allows us to see more of the species sequence distribution. Before we talk about the valley elderberry longhorn beetle, I do want to talk about the fact that the dominating color you see is green because of the large number of listed dicots that can really start to mask all the other species. And so that's why we've tried to make the dots transparent so you can start to see some of the other colors coming through. While one long sequence can be useful, unpacking the sequence in AMPs and the contributing variables can really help to inform discussions because you start to understand why is this species, in this case the valley elderberry longhorn beetle, sequencing at the top. The next few slides are going to walk through the species attributes that are influencing the potential for concern. So we're going to start with step 6 we were just talking about. The gray window in the graph indicates the level of effects and exposure, so the LOEE, and just as a reminder, that's effects plus overlap, or effects and overlap, where species are unlikely to be of concern based on the method introduced in the BEs following the release of EPA's work plan. So that is the area there in gray. So that is where your RQ divided by your LOC is equal to 1. So the LOEE is driving the species determinations as evidenced by the tight trend that you see in the graph. However, the sequence and deviations from the trend show how species attributes influence how other species attributes can affect the potential for concern. So as you can see, the species here, they have similar level of effects and exposure, so in this green circle, but there's different species attributes causing them to have different places on the sequence. So where this species here in the green dot is down between 0 and -1, this species with the pink dot here is a little above 2. So they have similar level of effects and exposure, but they have different species attributes that are placing them differently in different places in this sequence. And you can see, as reflected in the graph and in the chart prior to this, the Valley elderberry longhorn beetle is over here with a very high level of effects and exposure, putting it very high in this sequence. And we'll continue to talk through that on the other species attributes and how they fit into this discussion. So as we're moving back through the steps, we're going to go back to step 5, and we're going to look at incorporating the species risk modifiers. So you've already seen what the sequence looks like, but now we're going to break it apart. So in this graph, we have the population vulnerability on the y-axis and the level of effects and exposure on the x-axis. We're going to talk through the species attributes that we include in population vulnerability using the Valley elderberry longhorn beetle as an example. The Valley elderberry longhorn beetle has a threatened status, a large range size, its range is around 10 million acres, narrow environmental specificity, a decreasing population trend, and an unknown population size. You can notice it's over here on in the blue. Its sequence is not just about where it falls on the level of effects and exposure. So it's high on the level of effects and exposure, but for population vulnerability, it's not at the top. It's sort of in the middle of all the other species, which is being driven by the threatened status and the fact that it does have while it has a narrow environmental specificity, it's not a very narrow environmental specificity, and also the unknown population size that puts it in the middle. It doesn't put it as the same as a species that has a very, very small population size. Once we have the basic picture of the population vulnerability, we can then start to add in additional risk modifiers. So at this point, as you'll notice, these values are categorical, which creates definitive lines on the y-axis. There's very little refinement in population vulnerability, but we know that that is not the full picture. There are other attributes, particularly relevant for pesticides, that play a role in the vulnerability of the species. So the next risk modifier we include is overlap with federal lands. So why is including federal lands important? Species that are occurring predominantly on federal lands are protected from pesticide exposure through federal regulations that require consultation prior to the use of pesticides on federal lands, and management of federal lands is typically performed by federal land managers or those approved by federal land managers. Therefore, species that are predominantly on federal lands are assumed to have lower vulnerability than species predominantly on non-federal lands. And so we incorporated this overlap with federal lands to refine the population vulnerability so that we do get some distribution in the species as it relates to vulnerability. So for the Valley elderberry longhorn beetle, there's low overlap with federal lands, it's around 5%. But by including federal lands, the vulnerability of the Valley elderberry longhorn beetle is slightly reduced. However, for other species, we can really start to see the differences by how much they overlap with federal lands, and that is very evident in the number of species that move further down the y-axis towards 0. Lastly, we incorporate usage data and another modifier related to specifically to pesticides. So for the Valley elderberry longhorn beetle, contaminants are listed as a stressor. For AMPS, we cast a pretty wide net when it came to contaminants. We didn't just look for information related to pesticides. We looked for information related to water quality, agricultural contaminants. So we wanted to make sure that we weren't missing any space. So we do any species that may have pesticides listed as a stressor. So we recognize that this is a very, we have a much wider list of species where pesticides may be listed as a stressor, and that was intentional. We also incorporated usage for the Valley elderberry longhorn beetle. There is high usage. The usage data we've seen usage be incorporated into BEs and biological opinions differently depending on product. While California has detailed usage records by product, there is limited data for the remainder of the U.S., and data are only available for products currently on the market. So for new products, it becomes a bit more of a challenge. In sulfoxaflor and cyantraniliprole BEs, EPA estimated percent crop treated using the market leader approach applied at the state level, like the approach that they have been using for proposed new uses. In this step, in AMPS, usage was incorporated as a risk modifier at the class level, so herbicide, insecticide excluding nematicides, and fungicides based on the USDA Census of Agriculture data for treated agricultural lands, which is available at the state and county level. You can have high usage across a range, but have a very low level of effects and exposure. So those species should not be determined to be at risk just due to usage. And you can really see that here in this corner where you have low level of effects and exposure on the x-axis and low vulnerability when you incorporate fed overlap and usage at the on the y-axis. Including risk modifiers specific to pesticides does have a substantial impact on the vulnerability in the resulting sequence. To finish up the presentation, we're going to pull it back together to the sequence where we're looking at the sequence and the level of effects. The sequence through AMP supports discussions around mitigation measures for the species. And as we've unpacked the sequence, and we've thought about what goes into the level of effects, what goes into those risk modifiers, there are clear attributes that help inform what effective measures could be for the Valley elderberry longhorn beetle and for other species as we start to look at the entire sequence. For the Valley elderberry longhorn beetle, which has a high level of effects, high overlap with use data layer 70 or orchards, moderate population vulnerability, low overlap with federal lands, relatively high insecticide usage, and contaminants that have been identified as a stressor, placing it high on the sequence for an insecticide, at the top of the sequence to be exact. Therefore, mitigation, whether that's minimization, avoidance, or other measures, are warranted, as shown in some of the previous biological evaluations and proposed interim decisions. As we built the sequence, we've learned that this species has a large range and narrow environmental specificity, and those are two attributes that we've plotted here, where you have on the y-axis you have the log of the range size, and then on the x-axis you have environmental specificity, and you can see the Valley elderberry longhorn beetle there in the middle. A sub-range habitat specific mitigation measure would be more appropriate than a range-wide measure where you're doing the measure regardless of habitat location, because we do know where this species is. It is a large range with that habitat distributed throughout that range, but in very specific locations. For orchards, limiting mitigation measures to areas adjacent to the Valley elderberry longhorn beetle habitat would better reflect appropriate mitigation measures to protect extant populations. AMPS provides key insights into this species that can be used to inform practical, effective, and implementable mitigations in pesticide registration. Just a few concluding thoughts. AMPS is a tool to help inform discussions surrounding the need for and extent of practical, effective, and implementable mitigations in pesticide registration. To keep up with the ever-changing ESA FIFRA landscape, and we know that it will will continue to change over the next 18 to 24 months. AMPS is a flexible, repeatable, and adaptable tool. We will continue to compile the constantly changing and needed to be updated species data to support the needs of stakeholders involved in pesticide registration and registration review. AMPS provides a high-level view of listed species. It will not only support national pesticide consultations and discussions in those biological evaluations and discussions leading up to those and after the fact, but they can also help support systems-level approaches to species conservation, and I would also say support any regional projects that are ongoing or will be developed in the coming months. Additionally, after the break, there is a presentation prioritizing allocation of limited resources to reduce adverse effects of pesticide risk to endangered species. I would encourage you to come back after the break and hear Camilla's presentation. Thank you, and if you have any questions, my colleagues are in the room and they can answer those questions, or you can direct them to me via email, and that's on this slide. So once again, thank you. Have a good day.